Welcome back to the Path to Peace Therapy podcast. I'm Stephanie Buckley, AMFT, ADHD, and OCD specialist, family systems coach, and integrative mental health practitioner. I'm so grateful you've chosen to spend part of your day with me. Before we begin today's case study, I'd like to take a moment to explain why I created the Reality Case Studies trademark series and what I hope you'll take away from each episode. Throughout my years working with parents, couples, teenagers, young adults, athletes, and families, I've noticed that people rarely come to therapy because they simply want advice. More often, they come because they're trying to understand something that doesn't make sense. They find themselves asking questions like, why do we keep having the same argument? Why does my child respond so differently than my other children? Why do certain relationship patterns seem to repeat across generations? Why does one person pursue closeness while the other withdraws? How can two people genuinely love one another and still feel profoundly misunderstood? Those questions are rarely answered by quick tips or simple solutions. They require us to understand the emotional processes operating beneath the behavior we can see. One of the things I've learned as both a therapist and a lifelong student of human behavior is that psychological concepts become far easier to understand when we can actually watch them unfolding. Rather than studying theories in isolation, we have the opportunity to observe attachment, communication, emotional regulation, conflict, repair, boundaries, executive functioning, and family dynamics playing out in real relationships. When we can recognize these patterns in real life, psychology becomes more than an academic discipline. It becomes a practical tool for understanding ourselves and the people we love. When we watch people navigating conflict, repairing emotional injuries, establishing boundaries, responding to disappointment, expressing affection, or managing periods of uncertainty, we are witnessing psychological processes that researchers and clinicians have been studying for decades. Every conversation, every misunderstanding, every reconciliation, and every developmental transition offers an opportunity to better understand the intricate relationship between attachment, neurobiology, emotional regulation, cognition, family history, and the social environments in which people develop. These moments remind us that psychology is not merely a collection of theories confined to research journals or graduate classrooms. It is a living discipline that helps explain why relationships develop as they do, why familiar patterns often repeat across generations, and how lasting change becomes possible. Perhaps that is what I find most compelling about teaching psychology through publicly available case studies. Rather than asking listeners to memorize terminology or theoretical models, we have the opportunity to examine concepts as they naturally emerge within relationships that many people have already observed. As those patterns become more recognizable, listeners often discover that they begin noticing similar dynamics within their own families, friendships, workplaces, and intimate relationships. Psychology then becomes more than an academic pursuit. It becomes a practical framework for understanding ourselves, the people we care about, and the emotional processes that shape the quality of our relationships throughout the course of our lives. That is precisely why I created Reality Case Studies. Reality television, documentaries, and other publicly available stories provide a unique opportunity to examine evidence-based psychological principles through situations that millions of people have already witnessed. These conversations are never intended to criticize, diagnose, or speculate about the private mental health of public figures. I have never evaluated the individuals we discuss, nor would it be ethical to draw clinical conclusions about people I have never met. Instead, I use publicly available interactions as educational case studies that allow us to explore well-established concepts from developmental psychology, neuroscience, attachment theory, executive functioning, and Bowen Family Systems Theory. My hope is that by understanding the psychology behind these stories, you'll begin recognizing similar patterns within your own family, your own relationships, and perhaps even within yourself. Whether you're a parent trying to better understand your child, a couple working to strengthen your relationship, a therapist, educator, coach, or simply someone fascinated by why people think, feel, and behave the way they do, I hope each episode leaves you with greater insight, greater compassion, and practical tools that you can immediately apply in your own life. Before we begin today's discussion, I also want to offer an important ethical reminder. Every episode in this series is intended solely for psychoeducational purposes. The psychological concepts we discuss are grounded in established research and theory, while the case studies themselves are based entirely on publicly available information, including television programs, documentaries, interviews, podcasts, social media content, and published reports. Nothing in this series should be interpreted as a diagnosis or psychological evaluation of any individual. Our purpose is not to determine what is happening privately in another person's life. Our purpose is to better understand the universal psychological principles that influence all families. Because ultimately, reality case studies has never been about celebrity. It has never been about reality television. It has never been about deciding who is right and who is wrong. It has always been about using familiar stories to better understand the emotional patterns that exist within every family, including our own. Let's begin. Today's case study is Brooklyn Beckham. Before we begin, I want to make something abundantly clear. I have never met Brooklyn Beckham, Nicola Peltz, David Beckham, Victoria Beckham, or any member of either family. Everything discussed throughout this series is based entirely on publicly available interviews, documentaries, photographs, podcasts, media reports, and social media content. As a licensed associate marriage and family therapist, I believe deeply in the ethical responsibility of distinguishing between observation and diagnosis. I cannot diagnose someone I have never evaluated, nor would it be appropriate to speculate about private thoughts, motivations, or mental health conditions. Instead, what I hope to offer you is something very different. I want to use this highly visible family as an educational case study through which we can explore some of the most influential theories in psychology, neuroscience, family systems, and human development. There is a reason stories like this capture the attention of millions of people around the world. Most of us are not fascinated because the family is wealthy. Most of us are not fascinated because David Beckham is one of the most recognizable athletes in modern history. Because Victoria Beckham transformed herself from a member of the Spice Girls into a globally respected fashion designer, or because Nicola Peltz comes from one of America's wealthiest families. We pay attention because beneath the headlines lies a question that every parent, every spouse, every sibling, and every adult child has asked at some point in their lives. How does a family that appears to have everything arrive at a place where relationships become so fractured that an adult child publicly states he no longer wants contact with his family? That question is not unique to the Beckham family. Over the years, I have had the privilege of sitting with hundreds of families whose stories, although very different on the surface, often shared remarkably similar emotional themes. I have worked with parents whose adult children gradually stopped answering phone calls, replying to text messages, or accepting invitations to family gatherings. I have listened as mothers and fathers struggled to understand how a child they once tucked into bed every night could one day become emotionally distant, leaving them wondering where the relationship changed and whether it could ever be repaired. I have also worked with young adults who found themselves experiencing an entirely different kind of conflict. They deeply loved the family that raised them while simultaneously building a committed relationship with a spouse, fiancé, girlfriend, or boyfriend. Rather than feeling that these relationships could comfortably coexist, they experienced increasing pressure to navigate competing loyalties, conflicting expectations, and the emotional complexity that often accompanies the transition from one generation to the next. For many of them, the challenge was not deciding whom they loved more. The challenge was learning how to remain emotionally connected to multiple important relationships while preserving their own developing identity. I have sat beside siblings grieving relationships that had not ended through death, but through emotional distance. I have listened to brothers and sisters describe the profound sadness of watching someone they grew up with gradually become unavailable emotionally, physically, or relationally. I have supported grandparents who never imagined that birthdays, graduations, weddings, anniversaries, and the births of grandchildren would be experienced through photographs posted online rather than through shared family celebrations. There is a unique kind of grief associated with loving someone who is still alive while feeling as though the relationship itself has quietly disappeared. What has always struck me throughout my work is that these families were not living extraordinary public lives. They were simply people trying to navigate the joys and challenges of everyday life while carrying the emotional weight of relationships that had become increasingly complicated. Some were teachers preparing for another school year. Others were emergency room nurses working overnight shifts, engineers managing complex projects, accountants during tax season, or small business owners working long hours to support their families. I have worked with military families navigating deployments and reunions, police officers, firefighters, physical therapists, physicians, attorneys, executives, entrepreneurs, professional athletes, musicians, actors, stay-at-home parents, and grandparents. They represented every imaginable profession, culture, educational background, and socioeconomic circumstance. Although their lives looked very different from the outside, the conversations we had inside the therapy room were often remarkably similar. They spoke about missing someone they loved, trying to understand why relationships had changed, wondering if they had done something wrong, and hoping there might still be an opportunity to reconnect. The occupations were different. The financial circumstances were different. The family stories were different. But the emotional questions they carried were surprisingly alike. Over the years, that has reminded me of something I believe is fundamentally true about our relationships. Emotional pain does not discriminate according to profession, income, education, or public recognition. Whether someone is a teacher, a chief executive officer, a professional athlete, a musician, an actor, or a parent, Q sitting at the kitchen table wondering why their family no longer feels the way it once did, the need for love, belonging, connection, and secure relationships remains remarkably consistent. Perhaps that is one of the greatest misconceptions I encounter, both in my clinical work and within our broader culture. There remains a persistent belief that wealth, fame, influence, or public success somehow protect families from psychological suffering. We often imagine that extraordinary resources must naturally produce extraordinary happiness, or that financial security somehow insulates people from the emotional challenges experienced by everyone else. Developmental psychology and family systems research tell a very different story. Money unquestionably changes circumstances. It can provide beautiful homes, exceptional educational opportunities, outstanding health care, financial security, private travel, experienced advisors, and access to some of the world's leading experts across countless professions. Public recognition can create opportunities, influence, and experiences that very few people will ever encounter. Those advantages are real, and it would be inaccurate to pretend otherwise. What wealth and fame cannot purchase, however, are the very experiences that psychology consistently identifies as central to emotional well-being. They cannot purchase secure attachment. They cannot eliminate anxiety. They cannot guarantee healthy communication. They cannot prevent misunderstanding. They cannot erase unresolved emotional injuries carried forward from previous generations. They cannot ensure that children and parents will always remain emotionally connected as they move through the normal developmental transitions of adulthood. The nervous system does not distinguish between a child growing up in a modest apartment and a child growing up in a multi-million-dollar estate when it comes to the fundamental human need for safety, belonging, emotional connection, and secure attachment. Families may differ dramatically in their financial resources, public visibility, and opportunities, yet the psychological processes governing love, loss, rejection, conflict, grief, repair, hope, and resilience remain remarkably consistent across every socioeconomic background. Perhaps that is why stories like the Beckham families resonate so deeply with millions of people around the world, not because they are famous, but because the emotional questions their story appears to raise are questions that exist in families everywhere. They are questions about love, about loyalty, about identity, about belonging, about growing up, about letting go, and about whether relationships that have become strained can ever find their way back to one another again. This is precisely why I chose the Beckham family for our next extended reality case studies series, because they offer an extraordinary opportunity to examine universal psychological principles playing out on one of the world's most public stages. Every family listening to this podcast will recognize elements of their own story somewhere within these conversations. Perhaps it is the tension between parents and adult children. Perhaps it is the challenge of integrating a new spouse into an existing family system. Perhaps it is the complicated process of becoming your own person without losing the people who helped shape you. The names may change. The emotional processes often do not. To understand this story, we need to begin with one of the most influential thinkers in modern family therapy, psychiatrist Dr. Murray Bowen. Bowen fundamentally changed the way psychologists understand relationships because he proposed something that initially sounds deceptively simple. People cannot be fully understood apart from the family systems in which they develop. The phrase family system refers to the interconnected network of relationships through which people learn how to love, manage conflict, express emotions, tolerate disappointment, negotiate independence, and maintain closeness. Bowen argued that families function much like living biological systems. When one member of the system changes, every other member must adapt in some way. The emotional climate shifts, roles evolve, alliances strengthen or weaken, patterns of communication reorganize themselves. Even family members who live in different cities or different countries often continue responding emotionally to one another because the attachment bonds established during childhood remain deeply embedded within the nervous system. This concept stands in sharp contrast to the way many people naturally think about conflict. When relationships deteriorate, our instinct is often to identify a single person responsible for the problem. We search for the villain, the victim, the manipulator, or the rescuer. Bowen encouraged therapists to ask a more sophisticated question. Rather than asking, "Who caused this?" he asked, "What emotional process developed over time that now involves everyone connected to the family?" This shift from individual blame to systemic understanding represents one of the most significant contributions ever made to family psychology. As we explore Brooklyn Beckham's publicly reported estrangement from his parents, his close relationship with his wife, Nicola Peltz, his connection to her family, and the broader changes within his social world, I invite you to resist the temptation to decide who is right and who is wrong. Instead, I invite you to become students of psychology. Throughout this series, we will examine Bowen Family Systems Theory, attachment theory, developmental neuroscience, executive functioning, identity formation, symbolic psychology, the neurobiology of stress, the psychology of fame, the effects of growing up under constant public scrutiny, and what parents can learn from one of the most discussed family stories in recent years. Ultimately, this series is not about celebrity. It is about understanding the invisible emotional forces that shape every family. Because once you begin seeing families as emotional systems rather than collections of separate individuals, you can never look at relationships in quite the same way again. When most people think about families, they naturally think about the people who belong to them. They picture parents, children, siblings, grandparents, and perhaps aunts, uncles, and cousins. Bowen challenged us to think differently. He argued that the most important aspect of a family is not simply who belongs to it, but how the emotional connections between its members operate over time. He called this the family emotional system, and it remains one of the most influential concepts in modern family therapy. The family emotional system refers to the invisible network of emotional relationships that develops as people live together, raise children, solve problems, experience disappointment, celebrate achievements, navigate illness, recover from loss, and respond to one another across years and often generations. Although invisible, this emotional network is remarkably powerful because it influences how people interpret events, regulate emotions, manage conflict, establish trust, and maintain connection. Unlike a family tree, which simply tells us who belongs to the family emotional system explains how emotional energy moves between people. It helps us understand why one disagreement may be forgotten within hours, while another quietly reshapes relationships for decades. One of Bowen's most profound observations was that anxiety is contagious within families. He did not mean that anxiety spreads like a virus. Rather, he recognized that the emotional state of one significant family member often influences the nervous systems of everyone connected to that relationship. Neuroscience now supports many aspects of this observation. Through processes involving emotional contagion, mirror neuron systems, autonomic nervous system regulation, and co-regulation, people constantly respond to one another's emotional cues without conscious awareness. An anxious parent may unintentionally increase vigilance in a child. A chronically angry spouse may elevate tension throughout the household. Likewise, one emotionally regulated family member can often reduce the emotional intensity experienced by everyone else. In other words, nervous systems communicate long before words do. This becomes especially important when we consider families living under extraordinary circumstances. Most parents experience stress related to work, finances, raising children, or maintaining relationships. The Beckham family has lived for decades beneath a level of public scrutiny that very few people on earth will ever experience. Every career decision, every sporting achievement, every fashion choice, every interview, every parenting decision, every friendship, every holiday, and every family celebration has unfolded beneath cameras, newspapers, social media commentary, and public speculation. Whether those experiences strengthen the family or increase stress within the emotional system is something only they can truly answer. What we can say, however, is that chronic public observation introduces a level of environmental pressure that most developmental psychologists would expect to influence any family's emotional climate. Brooklyn Beckham entered that emotional environment at birth. Unlike many young adults who gradually develop an identity outside their parents' reputation, Brooklyn's earliest experiences occurred within what we might call brand Beckham. His father's extraordinary football career and his mother's global celebrity ensured that Brooklyn's developmental years unfolded in a world where strangers recognized his face before he had any meaningful opportunity to decide who he wanted to become. Developmental psychology reminds us that childhood is the period during which individuals gradually answer questions such as, who am I? What am I good at? What do I value? Where do I belong? Those questions become considerably more complicated when millions of people have already formed opinions about you before you have finished forming opinions about yourself. This does not mean fame inevitably creates psychological difficulties. Many children raised in highly visible families develop into emotionally healthy, psychologically resilient adults. Rather, the clinical question becomes whether the developmental tasks facing those children are fundamentally different. Imagine attempting to discover your own interests while newspapers compare your accomplishments with those of one of the world's most celebrated athletes. Imagine experimenting with careers while every success and every disappointment becomes an international headline. Imagine making ordinary developmental mistakes while social media permanently archives them. These experiences do not determine psychological outcomes, but they unquestionably become part of the emotional context in which identity develops. Family systems theory encourages us to widen the lens even further. Rather than asking whether one particular disagreement caused the current estrangement, Bowen would encourage us to examine the emotional climate that existed long before relationships became publicly strained. Every family develops predictable ways of responding to stress. Some families move toward one another. Some withdraw emotionally. Some avoid conflict altogether. Others rely upon one member to stabilize the emotional system whenever anxiety increases. These patterns often become so familiar that family members mistake them for personality traits when, in reality, they are adaptive responses to the emotional environment in which the family has functioned for many years. This is one reason therapists become deeply interested in patterns rather than isolated events. Weddings, public interviews, Instagram posts, family celebrations, or highly publicized disagreements rarely create emotional systems. Instead, they often reveal emotional processes that have been developing beneath the surface for years. Public attention naturally gravitates toward dramatic moments because those moments are visible. Bowen's work teaches us to become equally curious about the invisible processes that preceded them. Understanding those underlying emotional patterns frequently provides greater insight than analyzing any single event in isolation. As we continue through this series, I want to invite you to consider your own family while listening. Every family has an emotional system. Every family develops patterns of closeness, distance, loyalty, conflict, reconciliation, and adaptation. Some patterns strengthen relationships across generations. Others quietly increase emotional vulnerability without anyone recognizing the process until years later. The Beckham family simply provides us with an unusually visible opportunity to study psychological principles that exist in families throughout every neighborhood, every culture, and every socioeconomic level around the world. If Murray Bowen is remembered for one contribution to psychology, it is almost certainly his theory of differentiation of self. Although the phrase sounds highly academic, the underlying concept is remarkably practical because it addresses one of the most important developmental tasks every person faces throughout adulthood. Differentiation refers to an individual's capacity to develop a clear, stable sense of identity, while remaining emotionally connected to the significant people in their lives. In other words, differentiation asks a simple question. Can you become fully yourself without requiring someone else to become less of themselves? Notice what Bowen is not saying. Differentiation is not emotional detachment. It is not independence in the sense of needing no one. It is not rebellion, emotional distance, or proving that you no longer care about your family. Those ideas are often confused with maturity in contemporary culture. Yet Bowen argued precisely the opposite. Psychological maturity is measured not by how effectively an individual escapes relationships, but by how effectively they remain connected while continuing to think clearly, regulate their emotions, establish appropriate boundaries, and make decisions that reflect their own values, rather than reacting impulsively to the emotional intensity surrounding them. This distinction becomes critically important because many people mistakenly believe adulthood requires choosing between two competing identities. They assume they must either remain the loyal son or daughter they have always been, or become the devoted spouse they hope to be. Bowen challenged this false dichotomy. Healthy adult development does not require replacing one attachment with another. Rather, it requires expanding the emotional system so that multiple important relationships can coexist without constantly competing for loyalty. A differentiated adult is capable of loving a spouse deeply while continuing to love parents, siblings, lifelong friends, mentors, and extended family. Emotional maturity increases relational capacity. It does not progressively narrow it. From a developmental perspective, differentiation begins long before adulthood. Infants first learn to regulate their emotions through repeated experiences of co-regulation, a process in which attentive caregivers help organize the child's developing nervous system. As children mature, they gradually internalize these regulatory experiences, allowing them to soothe themselves, tolerate frustration, delay gratification, and recover from disappointment with increasing independence. During adolescence and emerging adulthood, another developmental challenge emerges. Young people must begin separating psychologically from their parents while remaining emotionally connected. They develop independent beliefs, careers, friendships, romantic relationships, political perspectives, spiritual values, and life goals. This process of individuation, described by developmental psychologists across multiple theoretical traditions, represents one of the defining tasks of early adulthood. When differentiation develops successfully, adult children become capable of disagreeing with their parents without experiencing overwhelming guilt, panic, or emotional paralysis. Parents, likewise, become increasingly capable of respecting those differences without interpreting them as rejection or betrayal. Family relationships evolve from hierarchical parent-child dynamics into adult-to-adult relationships characterized by mutual respect, emotional flexibility, and healthy interdependence. Disagreements continue to occur because conflict is inevitable within every meaningful relationship. The difference is that disagreement no longer threatens the existence of the relationship itself. Difficulty arises when emotional anxiety begins substituting for thoughtful decision-making. Bowen observed that under conditions of heightened emotional intensity, many people lose access to their best reasoning. Instead of responding from carefully considered values, they react from fear, guilt, anger, loyalty, or the urgent need to reduce emotional discomfort as quickly as possible. In these moments, decisions often become organized around emotional survival rather than thoughtful reflection. The nervous system prioritizes immediate relief, even when the long-term consequences may be painful. As I reviewed publicly available interviews, documentaries, photographs, and reporting concerning Brooklyn Beckham, I found myself repeatedly returning to this concept of differentiation. Publicly, Brooklyn has expressed profound devotion to his wife. He has spoken about always choosing her, described their relationship as existing within their own bubble, renewed their wedding vows, and covered much of his body with symbolic representations of their relationship, including reported references exceeding 100 tattoos. At the same time, public reporting has suggested significant emotional distance from his parents, brothers, and younger sister. Again, none of us knows the full private story, and it would be irresponsible to pretend otherwise. Nevertheless, these publicly reported patterns invite an important psychological question. When an adult's emotional world appears to become increasingly organized around one relationship while simultaneously contracting around numerous others, how might Bowen's concept of differentiation help us think about that process? Notice that I am intentionally asking a question rather than offering an answer. That distinction matters because responsible clinical thinking remains curious, where public commentary often becomes certain. Bowen would encourage us to ask whether the emotional system has expanded to accommodate a new marriage while preserving meaningful connections to existing family relationships, or whether the emotional system has reorganized around a pattern in which closeness with one relationship appears associated with increasing distance from many others. Those are fundamentally different developmental processes, and only the individuals involved truly know the emotional realities underlying their decisions. One aspect of this case that particularly captures my attention involves Brooklyn's younger sister, Harper. At approximately 14 years of age, Harper occupies a developmental period characterized by rapid neurological, psychological, and social change. Adolescence represents the beginning of identity exploration, increasing independence, heightened sensitivity to peer relationships, and the gradual formation of adult attachment patterns. Older siblings often occupy uniquely important roles during this stage because they represent bridges between childhood and adulthood. They model what growing up looks like. They demonstrate how adult relationships evolve. They frequently become trusted confidants precisely because they are not parents. When an older sibling becomes emotionally unavailable, younger brothers or sisters may experience not only grief but also uncertainty regarding the stability of family relationships more broadly. Again, we cannot know the private dynamics within the Beckham family. We can, however, recognize that sibling relationships occupy an important place within family systems, and their disruption often carries developmental significance, extending far beyond the two siblings directly involved. This chapter raises a question that I hope every listener asks themselves, regardless of whether they are a parent, spouse, sibling, or young adult. Has my world become larger because of the people I love, or has it become progressively smaller? Healthy differentiation generally allows relationships to multiply rather than compete. It encourages people to develop rich networks of family, friendship, purpose, community, and meaningful work. When the emotional world begins narrowing until one relationship carries the weight that was once distributed across many, psychologists become curious, not because closeness is unhealthy, but because no single relationship can comfortably sustain every emotional function a diversified attachment network was designed to provide. Perhaps that is Bowen's most enduring lesson. Becoming an adult does not require abandoning the people who helped shape your earliest identity. Nor does marriage require replacing one family with another. The healthiest developmental outcome is not emotional independence from everyone, but emotional maturity with everyone. Differentiation allows an individual to say, I know who I am. I know what I believe. I love my spouse deeply. I also remain capable of loving my parents, my siblings, my lifelong friends, and the people who helped me become the person I am today. That balance is rarely easy to achieve, yet according to Bowen, it represents one of the highest expressions of psychological maturity. Most commentators ask, who was right? Bowen asked a much more interesting question. What emotional process led to this outcome? One of the most influential and perhaps most misunderstood concepts within Bowen Family Systems Theory is emotional cutoff. In contemporary culture, people often celebrate cutting family members out of their lives as an act of empowerment. Social media frequently reduces extraordinarily complex family relationships to slogans encouraging people to protect your peace, remove toxic people, or cut anyone off who disturbs your energy. While there are absolutely situations involving abuse, violence, coercive control, or ongoing danger in which establishing firm boundaries or ending contact is both necessary and clinically appropriate, Bowen cautioned therapists against assuming that emotional distance automatically resolves emotional distress. His research repeatedly demonstrated that physically distancing ourselves from important attachment figures does not necessarily reduce the emotional significance those relationships continue to hold within our nervous systems. To understand emotional cutoff, we first need to understand the difference between a boundary and a cutoff. Although these terms are often used interchangeably in everyday conversation, they represent fundamentally different psychological processes. A boundary is an intentional, thoughtful limit established to protect psychological well-being while preserving the possibility of relationship. Healthy boundaries communicate, I care about this relationship, and because I care about it, I need to establish conditions that allow us to interact respectfully. Boundaries are flexible enough to evolve as circumstances change. They invite accountability, encourage repair, and preserve the possibility of future connection. An emotional cutoff, by contrast, is generally an attempt to reduce overwhelming emotional intensity by dramatically decreasing or completely eliminating contact with significant attachment figures. The primary objective is not necessarily punishment, it is emotional relief. The nervous system reaches a point at which remaining emotionally engaged feels intolerable, and distance appears to offer the quickest route towards psychological stability. From Bowen's perspective, however, emotional cutoff often changes the geography of the relationship more readily than it changes the emotional process itself. People may stop speaking to one another while continuing to think about one another every day. Physical separation does not automatically produce emotional freedom. This distinction becomes particularly important because unresolved attachment relationships frequently continue exerting tremendous psychological influence long after communication has ended. Parents may replay conversations for years, wondering where everything changed. Adult children may experience simultaneous relief, grief, guilt, anger, and longing. Siblings may feel caught between competing loyalties, unsure whether maintaining one relationship requires sacrificing another. Grandparents may grieve the absence of grandchildren they rarely or never see. Emotional cutoff, therefore, rarely affects only the two individuals who have stopped communicating. It reorganizes the emotional lives of everyone connected to the family system. Bowen observed that emotional cutoff frequently develops when differentiation of self has become exceptionally difficult. Recall from our previous discussion that differentiation involves maintaining one's own identity while remaining emotionally connected to important relationships. Individuals with stronger differentiation are generally capable of tolerating disagreement without requiring emotional distance. They can experience criticism without immediately severing the relationship. They can say, I disagree with your choices, while remaining psychologically available for future conversations. Emotional cutoff often reflects the opposite dynamic. The emotional intensity becomes so great that continued engagement feels impossible. Rather than learning how to remain connected while navigating disagreement, the nervous system seeks relief through distance. As we consider the publicly available reporting surrounding Brooklyn Beckham, Bowen Family Systems Theory encourages us to approach the situation with curiosity rather than certainty. One of the defining characteristics of Bowen's work was his belief that therapists should resist the temptation to draw immediate conclusions from limited information. Instead, they should carefully observe patterns, ask thoughtful questions, and consider how the emotional functioning of the entire family system may be contributing to the circumstances being observed. Public reporting has suggested that Brooklyn currently has little or no relationship not only with his parents, but also with his brothers and his younger sister. It is important to acknowledge that none of us knows the complete private story. We do not know what conversations have occurred behind closed doors, what efforts may have been made toward reconciliation, what misunderstandings may exist, or what emotional experiences each member of the family has privately endured. Responsible clinical practice requires tremendous humility because therapists recognize that publicly available information represents only a very small portion of a family's emotional reality. At the same time, Bowen Family Systems Theory teaches us that patterns are often more informative than isolated events. From a systemic perspective, therapists naturally become interested whenever emotional distance appears to extend across multiple relationships within the same family at approximately the same time. The focus is not on determining who is responsible or assigning blame. Rather, the therapist begins asking broader questions about the emotional process unfolding within the family as a whole. Bowen consistently emphasized that significant emotional reorganization rarely begins and ends with one relationship alone. Families function as interconnected emotional systems, meaning that changes occurring within one relationship often influence numerous other relationships simultaneously. When anxiety increases within the family, roles may begin shifting, alliances may strengthen or weaken, communication patterns may change, and emotional distance may gradually spread throughout the broader system. From Bowen's perspective, the clinical question is therefore not simply why two people appear emotionally disconnected. The more meaningful question is how the emotional functioning of the entire family may be reorganizing in response to increasing levels of anxiety. This systemic perspective is one of the reasons family therapists avoid oversimplified explanations. People naturally seek straightforward answers because certainty provides psychological comfort. Yet, family relationships are rarely organized around a single cause or a single moment. They evolve over years of shared experiences, developmental transitions, attachment relationships, unresolved disappointments, changing loyalties, life events, and the accumulated effects of countless interactions that outsiders may never fully witness. Bowen also observed that when emotional relationships become increasingly intense, people often develop adaptive strategies designed to reduce their own anxiety. These strategies are rarely deliberate or consciously chosen. Rather, they represent the nervous system's attempt to restore a sense of emotional safety within relationships that have become increasingly difficult to navigate. Some people become hypervigilant, remaining constantly alert for signs of rejection, criticism, or emotional withdrawal. They may begin monitoring conversations, facial expressions, text messages, or changes in tone because their nervous system has learned to anticipate the possibility that an important relationship could suddenly become threatened. Others develop a pattern of people-pleasing, believing that maintaining harmony requires suppressing their own needs, avoiding disagreement, or ensuring that everyone around them remains emotionally comfortable. Still others move toward emotional withdrawal, gradually convincing themselves that maintaining emotional distance is safer than risking vulnerability. If closeness has become associated with disappointment, conflict, or uncertainty, withdrawing from relationships may feel psychologically protective, even though it often creates greater loneliness over time. These responses should not be understood as character flaws. They are adaptive responses. The nervous system is continually attempting to answer one fundamental question: what do I need to do to remain emotionally safe? The answer to that question differs from one person to another because every family teaches its members different lessons about conflict, attachment, trust, vulnerability, and emotional security. Another important contribution Bowen made to family psychology is his observation that emotional cutoff frequently creates the illusion of resolution. When relationships become emotionally painful, increasing physical or emotional distance often produces immediate relief. Telephone calls become less frequent. Arguments become less intense because communication has diminished. Holidays become quieter. Family gatherings become less emotionally charged simply because fewer people are present. On the surface, this reduction in conflict may feel like evidence that the problem has finally been resolved. From Bowen's perspective, however, the absence of conflict should never be confused with the presence of resolution. Attachment relationships do not simply disappear because communication has stopped. Parents continue thinking about their children. Children continue thinking about their parents. Birthdays continue arriving. Holidays continue returning. Grandchildren are born. Parents grow older. Illness enters the family. Celebrations occur. Loss inevitably follows. Life continues, creating emotionally significant moments, and the attachment system often remains psychologically active long after communication has ended. Relationships may become physically distant while remaining emotionally present within the thoughts, memories, hopes, disappointments, and internal experiences of the people involved. Perhaps this is one of Bowen's most profound insights. Families are never defined solely by who is speaking to one another today. They are defined by the emotional processes that continue connecting people even when words are no longer being exchanged. Understanding those invisible processes is what allows therapists to move beyond blame and toward genuine understanding. This does not mean reconciliation is always appropriate or possible. Some relationships involve repeated abuse, manipulation, violence, or exploitation that make continued contact genuinely unsafe. Responsible family therapy never encourages individuals to remain in dangerous situations simply to preserve family harmony. Rather, Bowen encourages therapists to ask whether emotional distance reflects a carefully considered boundary established after thoughtful reflection, or whether it represents an attempt to escape emotional anxiety that remains unresolved internally. Those are two very different psychological processes, and distinguishing between them requires careful assessment rather than public speculation. Perhaps the most important lesson emotional cutoff offers parents, spouses, siblings, and adult children is this: relationships are rarely strengthened by pretending conflict does not exist. Healthy families learn to tolerate difficult conversations without interpreting disagreement as evidence that love has disappeared. They recognize that intimacy is measured not by the absence of conflict, but by the willingness to remain emotionally engaged while working toward understanding, accountability, and repair. Emotional maturity is demonstrated not by never experiencing relational pain, but by developing the capacity to remain psychologically present, even when relationships become emotionally demanding. As we continue exploring the Beckham family through the lens of psychology, emotional cutoff provides a crucial foundation for understanding everything that follows. It invites us to move beyond asking, "Why aren't they speaking?" and instead consider a more clinically meaningful question: what emotional processes made distance feel safer than continued connection? Bowen believed that answer is rarely found in a single event. More often, it emerges from years of interactions, accumulated emotional experiences, and patterns that slowly shape the way families learn to manage closeness, conflict, and belonging across generations. One of Dr. Murray Bowen's most influential contributions to family psychology was his description of what he called the emotional triangle. Although the concept sounds deceptively simple, Bowen believed it represented the smallest stable emotional unit within every family system. According to Bowen, when emotional tension develops between two people, the relationship naturally seeks stability by involving a third person, a third relationship, or sometimes even a third idea. In other words, anxiety rarely remains comfortably contained within a relationship experiencing significant distress. Instead, the emotional system attempts to redistribute that anxiety somewhere else in order to reduce the immediate pressure between the original two individuals. To appreciate the brilliance of Bowen's observation, imagine a marriage in which unresolved conflict has accumulated over several years. Initially, the disagreement exists between husband and wife. As emotional tension increases, however, one partner may begin confiding extensively in a child. Another may immerse themselves in work. Someone else may become emotionally preoccupied with a parent, a sibling, a close friend, religion, social media, or even a pet. None of these responses necessarily occur consciously. The nervous system is attempting to regulate overwhelming emotional intensity by redistributing it across additional relationships. The original conflict has not disappeared. Rather, the emotional load has been transferred throughout the broader system. This process is not limited to families experiencing major crises. Every family develops triangles because triangles are a normal feature in our relationships. A mother frustrated with her husband may seek reassurance from her sister. A father struggling with workplace stress may become increasingly invested in coaching his child's soccer team. Two siblings experiencing conflict may each recruit another sibling to validate their perspective. Even within healthy families, emotional triangles emerge naturally because they temporarily reduce anxiety. The clinical question is not whether triangles exist. The clinical question is whether they become the primary method through which a family manages emotional discomfort. From a neurobiological perspective, Bowen's theory aligns remarkably well with what contemporary neuroscience has taught us about emotional regulation. People are fundamentally social organisms. Our nervous systems continuously seek safety through connection with trusted attachment figures. When one important attachment relationship becomes emotionally threatening or unpredictable, the brain instinctively searches for another source of regulation. This process involves structures, including the amygdala, anterior cingulate cortex, ventromedial prefrontal cortex, and broader social attachment networks. Although Bowen developed his theory decades before modern neuroimaging became available, his observations anticipated many findings regarding interpersonal regulation and the contagious nature of emotional states within close relationships. As I considered the publicly available information regarding Brooklyn Beckham, one question repeatedly came to mind. If Bowen were sitting beside us today, where would he identify the emotional triangles within this family system? Notice that I am not asking who created them or who is responsible for them. Bowen consistently resisted assigning blame because he believed anxiety belongs to the emotional process itself rather than to any single individual. Instead, he would encourage us to observe how relationships reorganize themselves whenever emotional intensity increases. One triangle that naturally invites consideration involves the relationship among Brooklyn Beckham, his parents, and his wife, Nicola Peltz. Public reporting has frequently framed disagreements through the lens of competing loyalties. Again, none of us knows the private conversations that have occurred within this family, and it would be irresponsible to speculate about motivations. Nevertheless, from a systems perspective, the public narrative often appears organized around the question of where emotional allegiance ultimately resides. Bowen would suggest that whenever two important attachment systems appear to compete for emotional influence, the resulting anxiety may extend well beyond the individuals directly involved because everyone connected to those relationships begins responding to the increased emotional intensity. Another triangle that receives far less public attention involves siblings. Public discussion frequently centers on parents and spouses while overlooking brothers and sisters who continue living within the emotional consequences of family conflict. If public reports accurately reflect limited to no contact, extending beyond parents to include siblings, then those sibling relationships become clinically significant. Siblings often function as emotional bridges connecting childhood memories, family traditions, shared experiences, and multi-generational narratives. When those bridges weaken, the emotional geography of the entire family changes. Younger siblings, particularly adolescents still actively developing their own identities, may find themselves navigating emotional tensions they neither created nor fully understand. Modern families introduce additional triangles that Bowen never witnessed during his lifetime because social media did not yet exist. Today, millions of people participate in family conflicts without ever meeting the individuals involved. Instagram, TikTok, podcasts such as mine, documentaries, entertainment news, comment sections, and online communities all become potential participants in the emotional system. Every public statement invites interpretation. Every photograph becomes symbolic. Every birthday post, anniversary tribute, interview, or commercial is analyzed through competing narratives. Public opinion itself becomes a third point within the triangle, reinforcing some perspectives while challenging others. This phenomenon dramatically increases the complexity of family conflict because the emotional system no longer consists solely of relatives. It expands to include millions of observers, each bringing their own experiences, beliefs, and emotional histories into the conversation. One example that illustrates this complexity involves the public discussion surrounding David and Victoria Beckham acknowledging Brooklyn's birthday on social media, despite reports suggesting significant relational strain. Some commentators criticized the posts, arguing that meaningful communication should occur privately. Others argued that the Beckhams had publicly celebrated all of their children's birthdays for years, and that failing to acknowledge Brooklyn would likely have generated criticism of a different kind. From Bowen's perspective, the more interesting observation is not whether posting was correct or incorrect. The more interesting observation is how quickly millions of strangers became emotionally invested in interpreting the meaning of a family interaction they could observe but never fully understand. The triangle had expanded far beyond the family itself. This illustrates an important principle that extends well beyond celebrity culture. Whenever families involve outside participants to stabilize unresolved conflict, whether those participants are extended relatives, close friends, therapists, attorneys, churches, online communities, or public audiences, the emotional process becomes increasingly complex. Sometimes those outside relationships provide invaluable wisdom, accountability, and support. At other times, they unintentionally intensify polarization by reinforcing one perspective while reducing opportunities for direct dialogue between the people most deeply affected. The challenge for therapists is not eliminating all triangles. That would be impossible. The challenge is helping families develop sufficient differentiation that important conversations can occur directly whenever possible, rather than consistently flowing through third parties. Perhaps Bowen's greatest insight regarding triangles is that they reveal where anxiety is traveling rather than where blame belongs. Every triangle tells a story about an emotional system attempting to find stability under conditions of stress. When therapists learn to identify those patterns, the conversation shifts dramatically. Instead of asking, "Who is causing the problem?" we begin asking, "How is this family organizing itself in response to increasing emotional anxiety?" That question invites understanding instead of judgment, curiosity instead of certainty, and ultimately creates greater opportunity for healing because it acknowledges that every member of the family system participates in some way in the ongoing emotional process. What happens to the brothers and the 14-year-old sister while the adults are not aligned? That question sits at the heart of Bowen's work. One of the most fascinating aspects of Murray Bowen's family systems theory is that he believed the position a child occupies within the family has a meaningful influence on how that child learns to relate to other people throughout life. Bowen referred to this concept as sibling position, drawing heavily upon the earlier work of psychologist Dr. Walter Thoman, whose extensive research examined how birth order influences interpersonal expectations, leadership styles, conflict resolution, caregiving, responsibility, and emotional functioning. Although birth order does not determine personality or destiny, Bowen argued that children growing up in different positions within the family often experience markedly different developmental environments, and those experiences help shape how they understand relationships well into adulthood. The oldest child, for example, typically enters a family composed entirely of adults. For a period of time, parents direct virtually all of their emotional attention, expectations, and aspirations toward one child. Firstborn children frequently become the recipients of intense parental investment because every developmental milestone represents a new experience for the family. Parents often become more cautious, more involved, and more attentive because they themselves are learning how to parent for the first time. As younger siblings arrive, the oldest child frequently acquires additional responsibilities, consciously or unconsciously serving as a role model, helper, protector, or standard against which younger siblings measure themselves. Again, these are not rigid rules. Rather, they represent recurring patterns observed across many families. Brooklyn Beckham occupies precisely this position. As the oldest of David and Victoria Beckham's 4 children, he entered the world during an extraordinary period in his parents' lives. His father was rapidly becoming one of the most recognizable footballers on the planet. His mother had already achieved international fame as a member of the Spice Girls before beginning the next phase of her professional career. Unlike his younger siblings, Brooklyn experienced a period in which he was the family's only child, while simultaneously becoming one of the world's earliest celebrity children. Developmentally, these experiences likely differed considerably from those of Romeo, Cruz, and Harper because family systems naturally evolve with each additional child. Parents become more experienced, careers change, financial circumstances change, family routines change, public attention changes. Every child is born into the same family, and yet, psychologically speaking, into a different family. One of the greatest misconceptions regarding sibling relationships is the belief that they matter primarily during childhood. Developmental psychology consistently demonstrates the opposite. Sibling relationships frequently become the longest relationships people experience across the lifespan, often extending well beyond relationships with parents. Brothers and sisters share memories that no one else possesses. They remember family traditions, private jokes, childhood disappointments, vacations, holidays, illnesses, celebrations, losses, and developmental milestones through a uniquely shared perspective. They function as living historians of one another's lives. Even when siblings maintain very different personalities, careers, or lifestyles, they often carry a common emotional language rooted in experiences that began decades earlier. For this reason, therapists pay particularly close attention whenever sibling relationships undergo significant disruption. Parents eventually age and, yes, pass away. Children establish independent families of their own. Friends move away. Careers change. Siblings frequently remain among the few people capable of remembering where someone's story truly began. Consequently, when an adult becomes emotionally distant, not only from parents, but also from brothers and sisters, clinicians naturally become curious about the broader emotional process unfolding throughout the family system. Again, curiosity should never be confused with judgment. We simply recognize that sibling relationships occupy an extraordinarily important place within psychological development. As I examined the publicly available information regarding Brooklyn Beckham, one aspect that repeatedly captured my attention involved Harper Beckham. Public reporting has suggested limited contact extending beyond parents to include siblings, and Harper is still an adolescent. Adolescence represents one of the most important developmental periods in human life because it involves the gradual construction of identity, increasing independence from parents, expanding peer relationships, and the development of more sophisticated emotional regulation. During this period, older siblings frequently become particularly influential because they occupy a unique developmental position. They are close enough in age to feel relatable while simultaneously possessing greater life experience. They model adulthood in ways parents simply cannot. Imagine, for a moment, the psychological significance of an older brother when you are 14 years old. He is no longer simply the sibling who teased you as a child. He becomes someone whose approval matters differently. His career choices, friendships, romantic relationships, successes, disappointments, and responses to conflict all provide information about what adulthood might look like. Older siblings often become the people younger brothers and sisters quietly observe while asking themselves, is this what growing up means? Is this how adults solve problems? Is this how families remain connected when relationships become difficult? This is one reason Bowen believed sibling relationships deserve careful clinical attention. Children do not merely listen to what families teach. They observe what families demonstrate. Social learning theory, developed by psychologist Albert Bandura, similarly reminds us that people acquire many behaviors by observing significant others rather than through direct instruction alone. Parents may repeatedly tell children that family is important, forgiveness matters, and relationships should be protected. Yet children also watch how adults behave when relationships become emotionally painful. The observed behavior frequently becomes as influential as the spoken message. This observation raises an important question extending far beyond the Beckham family. What do younger siblings learn when they observe prolonged estrangement between adult family members? Some children conclude that difficult conversations should be avoided because conflict inevitably destroys relationships. Others become chronic peacemakers, assuming responsibility for maintaining harmony even when problems lie beyond their control. Still others become increasingly anxious about disappointing important people because they fear abandonment. These responses are not inevitable, nor can we assume they characterize any particular individual. Nevertheless, developmental psychologists recognize that family relationships provide ongoing lessons regarding trust, repair, loyalty, forgiveness, and belonging. Another aspect of sibling position that deserves attention involves the emotional role occupied by the oldest child within many families. Firstborn children frequently function, intentionally or unintentionally, as emotional reference points for younger siblings. Their choices often establish family expectations regarding education, careers, romantic relationships, independence, and communication. When the oldest sibling becomes emotionally distant from the family system, younger siblings sometimes experience not only grief, but also disorientation because an important point of reference has changed. The emotional map of the family must be redrawn. This chapter is not intended to suggest that oldest siblings bear greater responsibility for preserving family relationships. That would be both unfair and inconsistent with Bowen's theory. Rather, it reminds us that every relationship within a family reverberates outward in ways that are not always immediately visible. The emotional distance between two adults is rarely experienced exclusively by those two adults. Parents feel it, brothers feel it, sisters feel it. Future spouses may eventually feel it. Future children may one day inherit aspects of it. Family systems are remarkably interconnected precisely because attachment relationships seldom exist in isolation from one another. As we continue examining the Beckham family through the lens of Bowen Family Systems Theory, I hope listeners begin asking themselves a different question. Rather than focusing exclusively on conflict between parents and adult children, consider the brothers and sisters quietly living within the same emotional system. Consider the family rituals interrupted, the birthdays experienced differently, the holidays reorganized, the memories no longer shared in the same way. Psychology reminds us that relationships rarely disappear without leaving emotional traces. Those traces often become part of the developmental landscape through which younger family members continue constructing their own understanding of love, loyalty, conflict, and belonging. Multi-generational transmission is Bowen's most sophisticated concept because it explains why therapists often say, when most people think about inheritance, they naturally think about genetics, physical appearance, or financial assets. Families pass down eye color, height, medical conditions, property, businesses, traditions, and heirlooms. Bowen proposed that families also pass down something far less visible but equally powerful: emotional patterns. He called this process the multi-generational transmission process, and he believed it explained why certain relational patterns quietly repeat themselves across generations, often without anyone consciously intending them to do so. The multi-generational transmission process refers to the gradual movement of emotional functioning, relationship patterns, coping strategies, beliefs, and levels of differentiation from one generation to the next. Importantly, Bowen never suggested that children become copies of their parents. Rather, he observed that families transmit ways of responding to stress, intimacy, conflict, success, disappointment, responsibility, and emotional regulation through thousands of everyday interactions occurring across childhood. These patterns become woven into the developing nervous system long before children possess the language to describe what they are learning. Parents teach continuously, not only through the advice they intentionally provide, but through the relationships they model every single day. Contemporary developmental psychology strongly supports this broader principle. Children learn through observation long before they fully understand abstract instruction. They notice how parents disagree. They observe who apologizes first. They recognize whether affection continues after conflict or disappears until someone wins. They notice whether difficult emotions are welcomed, dismissed, criticized, or avoided. They learn whether mistakes become opportunities for growth or sources of shame. Over time, these repeated relational experiences become internal working model deep psychological expectations regarding how relationships operate. Although attachment theory uses somewhat different language than Bowen, both perspectives recognize that early relational experiences profoundly shape later interpersonal functioning. As I reflected upon the Beckham family, I found myself becoming increasingly interested not in any particular event, but in the broader family culture that has developed across decades. Publicly, David and Victoria Beckham have consistently emphasized qualities such as discipline, hard work, loyalty, perseverance, professionalism, and family commitment. David's football career required extraordinary dedication, relentless practice, emotional resilience, and the capacity to perform under enormous public pressure. Victoria's transition from international pop star to respected fashion designer similarly required remarkable persistence and tolerance for criticism. Whether one admires every decision they have made is ultimately beside the point. What becomes psychologically interesting is the family environment likely created by two individuals whose professional lives demanded sustained excellence over many years. Children raised within high-achieving families often receive tremendous gifts. They witness determination, discipline, sacrifice, and perseverance modeled daily. They learn that meaningful accomplishments usually require sustained effort rather than immediate gratification. At the same time, psychologists also recognize that exceptional achievement can unintentionally create unique developmental pressures. Children sometimes wonder whether their own accomplishments will ever measure up to those of their parents. They may struggle to establish identities independent of highly accomplished family legacies. Again, these experiences are not unique to celebrity families. The child of a renowned surgeon, respected attorney, successful entrepreneur, Olympic athlete, or university professor may confront similar developmental questions. The emotional challenge lies not in parental success itself, but in discovering one's own identity alongside it. This idea becomes particularly relevant when we consider family narratives. Every family tells stories about itself. Some families proudly describe themselves as resilient. Others emphasize service, education, entrepreneurship, athletic excellence, faith, creativity, or public responsibility. These narratives provide children with a framework through which they understand where they belong and what their family values most deeply. Publicly, the Beckham family has often been associated with professionalism, hard work, image management, and loyalty to the family brand. Those values likely provided significant strengths throughout the children's development. At the same time, every family narrative inevitably creates developmental tasks for the next generation, which must determine how to honor family history while simultaneously creating identities uniquely their own. One of the reasons I believe this case has captured so much public attention is that it appears to involve two exceptionally prominent family systems rather than one. On one side stands the Beckham family, whose identity has been shaped by international fame, athletic achievement, entertainment, fashion, entrepreneurship, and public visibility for decades. On the other side stands the Peltz family, whose identity has developed within extraordinary financial success, business leadership, philanthropy, and considerable influence. These are not merely two individuals entering a marriage. They are two established family cultures, each carrying its own traditions, expectations, communication styles, loyalties, and emotional histories. Family systems theory reminds us that marriage always involves the meeting of two emotional systems. In this case, those systems happen to be among the most publicly recognizable in the world. Importantly, this observation should never be interpreted as criticism of wealth or success. In fact, one of the recurring themes throughout this series is that money changes circumstances but does not eliminate psychology. Billionaires continue raising children. International celebrities continue navigating marriage. Business leaders continue experiencing disappointment, anxiety, conflict, and grief. Attachment remains attachment. Emotional regulation remains emotional regulation. Families continue teaching the next generation how to respond to life's inevitable uncertainties, regardless of whether they travel by private jet or public transportation. Human neurobiology does not distinguish between bank accounts when responding to belonging, rejection, criticism, or love. Perhaps the greatest contribution of Bowen's multi-generational transmission process is the hope it offers families. If emotional patterns can be transmitted across generations, they can also be transformed across generations. Every parent possesses the opportunity to interrupt unhealthy cycles while strengthening healthier ones. Families can learn to communicate differently than previous generations. They can apologize more readily. They can regulate emotions more effectively. They can encourage greater differentiation. They can teach children that conflict does not require emotional abandonment. They can model resilience rather than perfection. The goal is never to erase family history. The goal is to understand it well enough that future generations inherit greater emotional flexibility than previous generations possessed. As we prepare to conclude this first episode, I want listeners to consider one final question. When your children eventually describe your family to future generations, what emotional inheritance will they remember? Will they remember kindness, curiosity, emotional safety, accountability, repair, the ability to disagree respectfully? Or will they remember chronic anxiety, emotional distance, criticism, avoidance, and relationships that quietly dissolved whenever conflict became uncomfortable? Every family passes something forward. The remarkable opportunity each generation receives is deciding, with increasing awareness, what deserves to continue and what deserves to change. I also want to return to the question that first drew me toward this story. It was never whether David Beckham was right. It was never whether Victoria Beckham was wrong. It was never whether Nicola Peltz should have responded differently, nor whether Brooklyn Beckham made the correct decision. Those questions dominate public conversation because our brains naturally search for heroes and villains. They offer certainty. Psychology, however, rarely rewards certainty. Psychology rewards curiosity because human relationships are almost always more complicated than the narratives we construct around them. Over the course of this episode, we have explored several of Murray Bowen's most influential contributions to family psychology. We have examined the family emotional system, differentiation of self, emotional cutoff, emotional triangles, sibling position, and the multi-generational transmission process. At first glance, these concepts appear highly academic, yet together they describe something remarkably ordinary. They describe families attempting to love one another while simultaneously managing disappointment, anxiety, loyalty, conflict, changing identities, and the inevitable developmental transitions that accompany adulthood. Whether a family lives quietly in a rural community or beneath the relentless attention of international media, these emotional processes continue operating because they are fundamental aspects of human relationships rather than products of wealth or celebrity. Perhaps the most important lesson Bowen offers us is that adulthood is not defined by chronological age. Many people assume that becoming an adult simply means reaching 18, graduating from school, getting married, purchasing a home, or becoming financially independent. Bowen proposed something far more psychologically sophisticated. He suggested that adulthood is measured by an individual's capacity to remain emotionally connected while continuing to think independently. In other words, genuine maturity is demonstrated when a person no longer requires agreement in order to maintain love, no longer requires emotional distance in order to maintain personal convictions, and no longer experiences disagreement as evidence that relationships must end. This developmental achievement, which Bowen described through the concept of differentiation, represents one of the most difficult psychological tasks most people will ever undertake. As I reflected upon the publicly available information surrounding Brooklyn Beckham, I found myself thinking less about celebrity and more about thousands of ordinary families I have encountered throughout my clinical work. Some parents desperately want relationships with adult children who have disappeared from family life. Some adult children carry genuine wounds that deserve acknowledgement, accountability, and meaningful change. Some spouses feel trapped between loyalty to their partner and loyalty to the family who raised them. Some siblings grieve relationships that slowly faded without anyone fully understanding how the emotional distance became so great. These stories unfold every day in communities throughout the world. Most simply occur without cameras documenting every painful moment. One observation has remained with me throughout the preparation of this series. Public discussion frequently presents relationships as though love were a limited resource requiring people to choose sides. Listeners repeatedly encounter narratives suggesting that devotion to one's spouse necessarily requires emotional distance from one's parents, or that maintaining close relationships with parents somehow reflects insufficient commitment to one's marriage. Bowen would likely challenge this assumption because it creates a false dilemma. Healthy family systems are not organized around competing loyalties. They are organized around expanding emotional capacity. Marriage does not require replacing one family with another. Mature adulthood asks something considerably more difficult. It asks whether we can create sufficient psychological space to love deeply without requiring other important relationships to disappear. That does not mean every relationship should be preserved at all costs. There are families affected by abuse, coercive control, violence, chronic exploitation, or repeated emotional harm where substantial boundaries and sometimes permanent distance become necessary for safety. Responsible family therapy never encourages people to remain in relationships that continually place them in danger. At the same time, Bowen encouraged clinicians to distinguish carefully between protection and emotional reactivity, between thoughtfully established boundaries and emotionally driven cutoff. Those distinctions cannot be made by strangers reading headlines or scrolling through social media. They require careful understanding of individual histories, developmental experiences, patterns of interaction, and present-day realities. Humility, therefore, becomes an essential part of ethical psychological practice. If there is one idea I hope you carry with you after today's discussion, it is this: Every family possesses an emotional system that extends far beyond the visible conflict people see on the surface. Beneath every disagreement exists a developmental history. Beneath every family role exists a childhood. Beneath every emotional reaction exists a nervous system shaped by decades of attachment experiences. Understanding those deeper processes does not excuse harmful behavior, nor does it remove personal responsibility. What it does offer is a more compassionate, intellectually honest way of approaching human relationships. Psychology asks us to replace quick judgments with deeper questions because meaningful understanding almost always begins where certainty ends. As we move into our next episode, we are going to leave Bowen Family Systems Theory and enter an entirely different discipline, developmental neuroscience. We are going to examine what happens when a child grows up beneath extraordinary public scrutiny, how the developing brain constructs identity, why executive functioning continues maturing well into young adulthood, and how anxiety, neurodevelopment, fame, and environmental stress interact during one of the most important developmental periods in life. Understanding the brain will provide another layer of insight, not only into this public case study, but into the lives of countless young adults navigating the complicated journey toward adulthood. Until then, I want to leave you with a question that I believe every parent, every spouse, every sibling, and every adult child should ask themselves not just once, but repeatedly throughout life. Has my world become larger because of the people I love, or has it gradually become smaller? Healthy relationships rarely require us to become less connected to the healthy people who helped shape us. At their very best, they enlarge our capacity for love, deepen our understanding of ourselves, and expand the emotional community in which we belong. When relationships consistently require us to choose between entire groups of people we love, psychology invites us not to reach immediate conclusions, but to become profoundly curious about the emotional processes that made such choices seem necessary in the first place. Because ultimately, the greatest measure of psychological maturity is not how completely we separate from the people who came before us. It is whether we can become fully ourselves while remaining capable of sustaining meaningful, emotionally healthy connections with the people who matter most. What Bowen might ask the Beckham family: when did the emotional distance first begin? How were disagreements handled before the wedding? How did each generation learn to manage conflict? What role did siblings play before the current estrangement? What conversations have never actually been had? If everyone were sitting in my office today, what would each person be afraid of losing? As we come to the end of today's episode, I'd like to leave you with one final thought that I hope stays with you long after you've finished listening. One of the reasons I continue returning to Bowen Family Systems Theory throughout this series is because it reminds us that families are almost always more complex than they first appear. Whether we are looking at a family living in a quiet neighborhood or one whose life unfolds beneath the constant attention of the international media, every family develops emotional patterns that evolve over many years. Those patterns influence how family members communicate during conflict, how they respond to disappointment, how they express love, how they establish boundaries, how they cope with anxiety, and ultimately, how they define belonging. What we see on the surface is often only a very small part of a much larger emotional story that has been developing across decades and, in many cases, across generations. One of the greatest temptations we face as human beings is the desire to simplify complicated family relationships into categories that feel easier to understand. We naturally want to identify who is right and who is wrong, We search for someone to blame. We hope to identify a hero and a villain because certainty feels emotionally comforting. Yet psychology consistently reminds us that family relationships rarely fit neatly into those categories. Human behavior is influenced by personality, attachment, developmental experiences, family history, culture, stress, temperament, neurobiology, communication patterns, and countless life experiences that outsiders may never fully understand. As therapists, we are trained to approach those situations differently. Rather than immediately asking who caused the problem, we begin by asking a different question altogether. We become curious about the emotional process that may be unfolding beneath the behavior we can observe. We ask how anxiety is moving through the family system. We wonder how each person's developmental experiences may be influencing the way they interpret the same event. We become interested in the roles family members have learned to play, the expectations they have inherited, the loyalties they carry, and the emotional patterns that may have existed long before the current conflict ever emerged. That shift from judgment to curiosity is one of the most powerful changes any family can make. When we begin asking better questions, we often discover that the conversation itself changes. Instead of asking, "Why are they acting this way?" we begin asking, "What might they be experiencing that I cannot see?" Instead of immediately deciding who deserves our support, we begin wondering how years of family history, attachment experiences, emotional injuries, and developmental transitions may all be contributing to the present moment. Those questions do not excuse unhealthy behavior, nor do they remove personal responsibility. What they do provide is a deeper understanding of the emotional forces that shape human relationships. My hope is that this series has encouraged you to become just as curious about your own family as you may have been about the Beckham family. Perhaps you recognized patterns that reminded you of your own parents. Perhaps you saw yourself in the role of the adult child, struggling to balance loyalty to a partner with connection to your family of origin. Perhaps you found yourself reflecting on your own marriage, your own children, or relationships that have become strained over time. If that happened, then this conversation has accomplished exactly what I hoped it would. The purpose of reality case studies has never been to evaluate or judge public figures. It has always been to use publicly available stories as opportunities to better understand ourselves. Psychology becomes most meaningful when it moves beyond observation and becomes self-reflection. It is in those moments that we stop asking, "What's wrong with that family?" and begin asking, "What can I learn about my own?" Perhaps that is Bowen's greatest gift to all of us. He reminded us that lasting change rarely begins by trying to change someone else. It begins when we become more aware of our own patterns, our own emotional responses, and our own role within the relationships that matter most. The more clearly we understand ourselves, the more thoughtfully we respond to others. The more thoughtfully we respond, the greater our opportunity to interrupt patterns that may have been passed from one generation to the next. That is how family legacies begin to change. Not through blame, but through awareness, intentionality, and the courage to respond differently than we have before. In our next episode, we're going to leave Bowen Family Systems Theory and turn our attention to another remarkable area of psychology, the developing brain. We'll explore what neuroscience teaches us about executive functioning, emotional regulation, delayed gratification, motivation, decision-making, and why the brain continues developing well into young adulthood. We'll examine why some young adults seem ready to navigate life's responsibilities, while others continue struggling with organization, planning, impulse control, and emotional regulation, not from the perspective of character, but from the perspective of brain development. Because before we can fully understand behavior, we first need to understand the remarkable organ responsible for producing it. I hope you'll join me next time. Remember, you are not too late for the life that's meant for you.